The rain fell in relentless, slanting sheets against the tall, arched windows of Grand Hill College, drumming a frantic, chaotic rhythm on the slate roof. Each drop that struck the century-old glass sounded to Leah like a tiny, insistent finger tapping to be let in. Inside, the silence of the English department hallway was a deep and profound thing, a heavy blanket that swallowed sound, broken only by the storm and the dry scratch of her red pen across paper. It was nearly midnight. The last of the other late-working faculty had packed up hours ago, their sensible shoes squeaking on the polished linoleum as they'd wished her a good night, their voices echoing unnaturally in the growing emptiness. But Leah had a mountain of freshman essays to grade, and the quiet, empty school had always felt more like a sanctuary than a threat. The familiar scent of old paper, chalk dust, and floor wax was a comfort, a pleasant ghost of the day's academic bustle. Grand Hill was the oldest building in the county, a hulking Gothic structure of stone and dark wood that had accumulated its share of ghost stories. Students whispered tales of a gray lady who haunted the library stacks, searching for a book she'd lost in 1923, and of phantom footsteps in the empty theater. Leah, a pragmatist to her core, had always dismissed them as charming local folklore. An old building was bound to creak and groan. It had character, that's all. The first sound that was not the storm or her pen was a distant, metallic clang from down the hall, sharp and jarring in the oppressive quiet. Leah paused, her pen hovering over a poorly constructed thesis statement. It was probably just a locker door settling or a pipe shuddering in the ancient walls. Nothing more. She took a sip of her cold, bitter coffee and went back to work, forcing her focus onto the page. A few minutes later, it came again, closer this time and louder. A definitive two-part sound, a door being opened and then deliberately shut. She frowned, putting the pen down for good this time. "Hello?" she called out, her voice feeling small and thin in the vast emptiness. Only the drumming rain answered. The silence that followed her call felt different, heavier somehow, as if it were listening. She told herself it was the janitor, old Mr. Abernathy, doing his final rounds. But he usually finished by 10, and his cart had a distinctive, rattling squeak that always announced his approach from 100 yards away. This was just silence. A sudden invasive shiver traced its way down her spine. The air in the classroom, usually stuffy and warm, had grown noticeably colder, a damp, cellar-like chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. She rubbed her arms and peered out the small rectangular window in her classroom door. The hallway was a long cavern of shadows, punctuated by the weak yellow glow of the emergency lights. It was completely, utterly empty. She was about to turn back to her desk when she heard it again, a soft, dragging sound. It was rhythmic, wet, like a heavy sodden bag being pulled slowly across the floor, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. It was coming from the far end of the hall, moving in her direction. Leah's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't the building settling. She fumbled with the lock on her door, her fingers suddenly clumsy and slick with sweat, and slid the bolt home with a loud metallic thunk that seemed to echo forever. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide, and grabbed her phone from her desk. No signal. Of course. She snatched the receiver of the landline. It was dead, the silence on the line as unnerving as the sound in the hall. The sound was right on her door now. It wasn't a knock. It was light, exploratory, almost delicate, like the pecking of a bird's beak against the wood. Leah held her breath, pressing herself against the cold blackboard, the chalk dust dirtying her sweater. The dragging sound had stopped, but the tapping continued, patient and unnervingly persistent. Then, a new sound joined it, a small, high-pitched giggle. It was the sound of a child, a sound that should have been innocent, but was instead laced with a chilling, knowing malice. It was coming from just outside her door. Leah's blood ran cold. Every rational thought fled her mind, replaced by a primal screaming terror. Slowly, a shape began to resolve in the frosted glass of the door's window. A small, pale face, no older than 7 or 8, with wide, dark eyes that seemed to drink the dim hallway light, leaving only black voids. The child's face was pressed against the glass, its breath fogging a small circle. It smiled, a slow, dreadful smile that was entirely wrong, a rictus of mirth on a face devoid of life. Leah couldn't scream. The sound was trapped in her throat, a choked, silent sob. The face in the window vanished. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and her own frantic heartbeat. Then, the scratching started. It was frenzied, desperate, the sound of ragged fingernails digging into the thick oak of the door, splintering the wood with sharp, tearing noises. Suddenly, all the lights in the classroom flickered twice, the old bulbs buzzing angrily, and died. The reassuring glow of her desk lamp vanished, plunging her into absolute suffocating darkness. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound she had ever heard. She fumbled in the dark for her heavy oak desk, her hands shaking so badly she could barely stand. She began to push it, grunting with the effort, scraping its legs across the floor to barricade the door. No need for that. The voice was a dry, graveyard rasp, and it came from the corner of the room behind her. Leah froze, every muscle in her body locking in place. The smell of damp earth, wet leaves, and something acrid like rusted metal filled the air. With a trembling hand, she found her phone and managed to turn on its flashlight. The beam cut a shaky cone through the oppressive blackness. It landed on a tall, gaunt figure standing by the windows. He wore the tattered gray uniform of a janitor, and his skin was the color of old parchment stretched tight over bone. He held a tarnished brass lantern in one hand, though it emitted no light. His eyes were hollow sockets of shadow. Murky water dripped from his clothes, forming a dark, spreading puddle on the floor around him. It was the source of the dragging sound. At his side, clutching his leg with a small, grimy hand, was the little girl from the hallway. Her dress was muddy and torn, and her smile was a terrifying black gash in her pale face, as if her mouth were full of grave dirt. Leah finally found her voice, a raw, ragged scream that tore from her lungs. She scrambled backward, tripping over a chair and crashing to the floor. The flashlight flew from her hand, its beam spinning wildly across the ceiling before settling on the far wall. The janitor took a slow, shuffling step towards her. The little girl did not move, but her head tilted at an impossible, sickening angle, her grin widening. "You're in my school," the janitor rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "The bell rang hours ago. It's time to go home." He raised his free hand, and in it, he held a single, long, rust-eaten key. "I always lock up." Leah never remembered getting out. She only remembered the blinding terror, the feeling of an unnatural, grave-like cold washing over her as she crab-walked backward, away from the advancing figure. She remembered scrambling through the door she had just barricaded, a door that now stood impossibly, unnaturally wide open. She ran, her bare feet slapping against the wet linoleum, the child's delighted laughter echoing behind her, chasing her down the endless, shadowed halls of Grand Hill College. She burst out into the stormy night, the cold rain a shocking but welcome baptism. She ran and did not look back, leaving the iron gates of the college and her life there behind forever. No one ever saw Leah again. The official report cited a sudden resignation due to a nervous breakdown, a story no one questioned. Her car was still in the faculty lot, her meticulously graded essays still stacked neatly on her desk. But late at night, when the rain falls hard on the old stone walls of Grand Hill, the janitors swear they can sometimes hear a new sound in the empty English department, the faint, frantic scratching of a red pen, and a soft, insistent tapping on a classroom door that will never, ever be opened. The beam of Michael's flashlight cut a nervous path through the cavernous dark of Silver Lake University's main library. It was his 3rd month on the night shift, a job he'd taken for the quiet solitude it promised. And for the most part, it delivered. The silence of the sprawling campus after midnight was a thick, heavy blanket, disturbed only by the hum of ancient refrigerators in the staff rooms and the scuttling of unseen things within the walls. He walked between monoliths of silent knowledge, the spines of thousands of books forming a canyon of shadows. At night, the library didn't feel like a place of learning. It felt like a tomb, and he was its sole, lonely keeper. Michael was a man who prided himself on logic. He believed in faulty wiring, drafts from old window frames, and the tricks an overtired mind could play after 6 hours of staring into the dark. He did not believe in the stories the day shift guards swapped with morbid glee, tales of the Silver Lady, the ghost of a student from the 1950s, who, according to legend, had thrown herself from the clock tower after a love affair with a professor went sour. They said her head had been severed by a decorative gargoyle on the way down, and that she now wandered the halls, forever searching for it. Michael had always scoffed, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. Every old institution had a ghost story. It was practically a requirement, a bit of morbid fun to pass the time. The strange occurrences began subtly, small tears in the fabric of his rational world. A book of bleak poetry left splayed open on a reading table he was certain had been clear. A single door to a lecture hall standing wide open when he knew with absolute certainty he had locked and rattled it an hour before. He blamed fatigue, the monotony of the rounds. He started drinking more coffee, turning the bitter liquid into a sacrament against sleep. He began double-checking his rounds, making meticulous, almost obsessive notes in his logbook to prove to himself he wasn't losing his mind. Then came the whispers. Faint, airy sounds carried on the ventilation system, too indistinct to be words, but unmistakably vocal, like a sigh drawn out over an impossible length. He'd freeze in a hallway, the hairs on his arms standing on end, straining his ears, only for the sound to fade into the building's monotonous hum. He climbed a ladder in the maintenance closet, pressing his ear to the cold metal of the vents, searching for a logical source, but found nothing. The logical explanations were beginning to wear thin, leaving a raw, exposed nerve of fear. The first time he saw her, it was just a flicker in his peripheral vision, a flaw in the darkness. He was walking the long, echoing corridor of the Fine Arts building, the walls lined with plaster busts, whose shadowed eyes seemed to follow him with a cold, judgmental stillness. At the far end of the hall, a figure in white darted from one doorway to another. It was too quick, too far away to be clear, just an impression of movement and pale fabric. "Hello?" Michael called out, his voice sounding small and tight in the oppressive space. "Campus security, is someone there?" Only silence answered, a silence that felt deeper and more absolute than before. He walked the length of the hall, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs, his footsteps the only sound. He checked every room, his hands slick with sweat on the cold brass knobs. They were all empty, locked from the outside. A trick of the light, he told himself, his hand trembling slightly as he brought a cigarette to his lips later that night. A shadow, a reflection, nothing more. But the sightings grew more frequent, more defined. A woman in a dated white dress, seen from behind, her shoulders slender, her posture oddly stiff and formal. She was always at a distance, a fleeting image at the end of a long corridor, moving away from him, turning a corner just as his light was about to fall fully upon her. He never saw her face. He began to feel a specific personal dread associated with the Fine Arts building, a place he once found peaceful. Now, the oil portraits on the walls felt like an audience of the dead, and the abstract sculptures seemed poised to move the moment he turned his back. One Tuesday night, a storm rolled in over the lake, rattling the century-old window panes and cutting the power with a sudden, final clap of thunder. The emergency generators kicked in, casting the hallways in a hellish, intermittent orange glow that made the shadows writhe. Michael was in the administrative building when the darkness fell, and a new, profound silence pressed in on him. This was a different kind of quiet. It felt heavy, expectant, like the held breath before a scream. His radio crackled. It was his supervisor, Dave. "You good over there, Mike? Power's out all over the north side of town." "All good, Dave. Generators are on. Just another night in paradise," Michael lied, his voice betraying a tremor he couldn't control. He decided to do a full sweep, starting with the place he dreaded most. As he entered the fine arts building, the air grew instantly cold, the kind of damp chill that sinks right into your bones and stays there. The emergency lights flickered erratically, throwing strobe-like shadows that danced like frantic ghosts. He heard a noise from the floor above, a soft, wet dragging sound, a sound of immense weight being pulled across old wood. Against his better judgment, he took the stairs, his heavy boots echoing on the marble. The dragging sound led him towards the old, disused ballroom on the second floor. The grand double doors were slightly ajar, a sliver of pulsing orange light spilling from within. Michael knew they were always kept locked and bolted. He pushed one open, the hinges groaning in protest. The vast room was empty, dust motes dancing like frantic insects in the beam of his flashlight. At the far end, a set of French doors led to a small balcony overlooking the churning, storm-tossed lake. One of the doors was open, the curtain billowing inwards like a pale spirit. He walked towards it, his light scanning the floor. That's when he saw the trail. Wet footprints, small and bare, leading from the balcony into the center of the room, where they simply stopped. As if the person who made them had vanished into thin air. A floorboard creaked behind him. Michael spun around, his heart seizing in his chest. Standing in the doorway, partially obscured by the shadows, was the woman in the white dress. This time, she wasn't moving away. She was perfectly still, facing him. The flickering emergency light cast her in a sickening orange glow, then plunged her into shadow, then lit her up again. "Ma'am, the university is closed," he managed to say, the words feeling foolish and inadequate. She didn't respond. She just stood there, her body rigid. He took a hesitant step forward, raising his flashlight, the beam shaking wildly. He swept the beam up from her soaked, tattered hem, past her waist, over the delicate, lace-covered bodice of her dress. And then he saw it. Where her head and neck should have been, there was nothing. Just a clean, dark, horrifying void. The top of her dress ended in a ragged, empty collar. It was a perfect, impossible silhouette of a person who had been utterly erased from the neck up. His mind screamed, trying to reconcile what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't a shadow. It was a presence, an absence, a walking violation of nature. The headless figure took a slow, deliberate step into the room. A sound came from the empty space above her shoulders, a faint, gurgling whisper, like water draining down a rusty pipe. It was the sound he had been hearing through the vents, now horribly close. As she moved, her shoulders tilted slightly, an impossibly fluid motion for a body with no neck, as if an unseen head were looking around the room. He finally found his voice, a strangled animal cry. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet and crashing to the floor. His flashlight flew from his hand, rolling across the dusty floorboards and coming to rest with its beam pointing at the ceiling, plunging the room into a disorienting chaos of shadow and weak, pulsating light. The gurgling grew louder, wetter. He scrambled away, crab-walking backward until he hit the far wall, the rough plaster scraping his back. The figure continued its slow, inexorable advance. It was searching for something. He knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins, that it was searching for a head, and in the dark, in her world of eternal loss, any head would do. The last words Jane read were about the socio-economic impact of post-war agrarian reforms. Riveting stuff. So riveting, in fact, that her eyelids, heavy as lead shutters, finally slid closed. The scent of old paper and binding glue filled her nostrils, a comforting aroma that had always signaled safety and knowledge. Her head drooped, her cheek finding a surprisingly comfortable pillow in the dense open pages of her history textbook. The low golden light of the late afternoon sun, filtering through the tall arched windows of the St. Augustine University Library, made dust motes dance in the air like tiny, silent fairies. It was the last thing she saw. When she awoke, it was to a different world, a world of absolute, impenetrable black. A painful crick in her neck was the first sign something was wrong. The second was the profound, suffocating silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was a dead void. The familiar, gentle hum of the library's air conditioning was gone. The distant rustle of turning pages, the soft coughs, the scrape of chairs, all vanished. The silence was a physical pressure, a weight in the air that made her ears ache. Jane sat bolt upright, every muscle tensed, her heart starting a frantic, clumsy rhythm against her ribs. She fumbled for her phone, its sudden harsh glare making her squint in pain. The screen glowed with stark, terrifying numbers. 1:27 a.m. "No," she whispered, the sound stolen by the oppressive quiet, barely reaching her own ears. "No, no, no." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her drowsiness. She scrambled out of the secluded study carrel, her phone's flashlight beam cutting a nervous, dancing path through the darkness. The library, a place of comfort and knowledge by day, had transformed into its negative image. The towering shelves, packed with thousands of silent, watching books, now looked like monolithic tombstones in a vast indoor cemetery. The shadows they cast were long, distorted, and seemed to writhe and coil just at the edge of her light, like living things waiting for her to look away. Her footsteps echoed like gunshots on the marble floor as she rushed to the massive oak doors at the main entrance. She pushed. Nothing. The wood was cold and unyielding. She shoved with her shoulder, her breath coming in ragged gasps that clouded in the chilly air. The doors didn't budge. Through the reinforced glass panels, she could see a thick, heavy chain looped through the handles, secured by a formidable padlock that gleamed dully in her phone's light. She was locked in. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She stumbled from one potential escape to another, her hope dwindling with each rattling, unyielding handle of the side exits. Every window was barred, a standard feature for the ground floor she'd never truly noticed before. She was a prisoner in a fortress of forgotten words. Defeated, she leaned against a row of shelves, the spines of books pressing into her back as she tried to force down the lump of fear in her throat. She had to think. The security guard made his rounds at 6 a.m. She just had to wait. 5 hours, she could do that. It was then that she heard it. A soft, wet, rhythmic sound. It was faint but unmistakable in the dead air, and it was coming from the far corner of the library, from the direction of the restrooms. The comfort room, as the quaint old sign called it. Jane froze, straining her ears, every nerve ending alight. A leaky pipe? The old building was full of strange noises, but this was different. It was deliberate, methodical. The drip was heavy and thick, like a saturated sponge being squeezed, and the drag was the sound of something limp and heavy being pulled across the tile floor, a friction-filled, flesh-like sound. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, to find her Carol and curl up and hide until morning. But a terrifying, morbid curiosity took root, entwined with a sliver of foolish hope. What if someone else was in here? What if they were hurt? Clinging to that rational, humane thought was her only defense against the primal fear that threatened to swallow her whole. Holding her phone out like a weapon, the light beam trembling, she began to walk slowly towards the sound. The journey through the maze of shelves felt miles long. With each step, the sound grew marginally louder, the smell hitting her next. It was a foul, coppery stench, the scent of old pennies and spoiled meat, so thick she could almost taste it. The door to the women's comfort room was slightly ajar, a dark slit in the wall. The rhythmic dripping and dragging was coming from within. She nudged the door with her foot, and it swung open with a low, drawn-out creak that seemed to last an eternity. The smell inside was overpowering, a gag-inducing wave of decay. The room was dark, save for her flashlight beam. She swept the light across the row of sinks, the mirrors reflecting a distorted, wide-eyed version of her own terror. The floor was wet, but not with water. A dark, viscous trail glistening like crude oil snaked from the entrance to the last stall at the very end. Its door was closed. The sound was right there, just behind that thin wooden door. "Hello?" Jane called out, her voice a pathetic squeak. Is anyone in there? Are you okay?" The only answer was the continuation of the horrid, rhythmic noise. Her light drifted down to the gap between the stall door and the floor. The dark, sticky trail led directly under it. She could see something moving inside, something pale and waxy in the gloom. It wasn't a pair of shoes. It was something that looked disturbingly like a hand, but the fingers were too long, too thin, like bleached twigs, and they bent at an unnatural angle. They were methodically, almost lovingly, stalking the grimy floor, smearing the dark liquid back and forth in a repeating pattern. A guttural rasping sound joined the dripping. It was a voice, a low, wet whisper, like someone trying to speak while gargling mud. It wasn't speaking words, just exuding a sound of vile, private pleasure. Pure, unadulterated terror seized Jane. This was wrong. This was unholy. She stumbled backward, her hand hitting a metal trash can. It overturned with a deafening clang that echoed through the library like a thunderclap, a violent desecration of the silence. Inside the stall, everything stopped. The dripping, the dragging, the whispering, all ceased. The silence that followed was somehow 1,000 times worse. It felt heavy, expectant. Then, with a sound that ripped through the quiet like a snapping bone, the lock on the stall door clicked open. Jane didn't wait. She turned and ran. She sprinted blindly into the labyrinth of shelves, her own panicked sobs and gasps filling her ears. Behind her, she heard the stall door groan open, followed by the... It was no longer a limp pull. It was the sound of pursuit. A high-pitched, chittering giggle echoed from behind her, a sound of pure madness that scraped at her sanity. She ducked behind the main circulation desk, squeezing herself into the knee-hole space and pulling a rolling chair in front of her. She clamped her hands over her mouth, stifling her breath, tears streaming down her face. The dragging sound grew closer, punctuated by the wet, slapping sound of something heavy hitting the marble floor. She could smell it. That awful, rotten metal smell was right on top of her, clinging to her clothes, filling her lungs. The dragging stopped right on the other side of the desk. Jane held her breath, praying it would move on, that it hadn't seen her. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then, a single thick, dark drop of liquid splattered on the floor right beside her trembling hand. Slowly, shakily, Jane tilted her head up. Peering over the top of the desk, not 3 feet from her face, was a woman, or what had once been a woman. Her skin was the color of old parchment, stretched so taut over her skull that it looked ready to split. Her hair was a matted, wet mess, clinging to her head in dark, stringy clumps. But her eyes were wide, black, bottomless pits that seemed to drink the light from her phone, devoid of lids or lashes. Her mouth was a gaping, silent scream, a perfect O of horror, from which the dark liquid dribbled, running down her chin and dripping onto the floor. It hung there in the air, its head cocked at an impossible angle, its lightless eyes scanning the darkness. It hadn't seen her yet. Jane couldn't hold it in. A small, choked gasp escaped her lips. The head snapped down. The black, empty eyes locked onto hers. The silent scream on its face seemed to stretch impossibly wider, the skin at the corners of its mouth tearing slightly. A low, rattling groan vibrated from its throat as it began to hoist its limp, dragging body over the desk with a grotesque, boneless fluidity. The next morning, the janitor unlocked the library doors to a scene of chaos. A metal trash can was overturned near the restrooms, and a rolling chair lay on its side by the circulation desk. There was no sign of the student who had been reported missing by her frantic parents. All the police ever found was her history textbook, left open on a desk in a secluded carrel, and her cell phone, lying on the floor beneath the main desk, its screen spiderwebbed with cracks, and leading from the desk to the permanently closed and locked door of the women's comfort room was a long, dark, and sticky smear, a permanent scar on the marble floor, as if something heavy and wet had been dragged back into the darkness from which it came.